Hello, welcome to Newscentre. With me, Parikshit Luthra. Russia has mounted its offensive in Ukraine, launching a series of airstrikes across multiple cities, including the capital city of Kyiv. The strikes smashed civilian targets, killing at least 19 people and leaving over 100 injured. Air raid sirens are daunting over several regions in Ukraine, warning of the possibility of more Russian airstrikes. Russian President Putin called these strikes a response to Kyiv's terrorist action, including an attack on a bridge to the Russia-controlled Crimean Peninsula. These attacks come days after Ukraine claimed to have regained territories captured by Russian forces. Ukrainian President Zelensky, in his nightly address, said Ukraine is not intimidated by the Russian strikes and his forces would make the battlefield more painful. Meanwhile, India voted to reject Russia's demand to have a secret ballot in the UNGA on annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions. The government has also advised citizens to not travel to Ukraine amid the ongoing conflict. Let me go across to our guests this evening. We are joined by Tom Karako, Director of Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Also joining us is Bohdan Nahaylo, Chief Editor at the Kyiv Post. Thank you very much for joining us. Tom, let me begin by asking you, how would you differentiate the intensity of Russian action that we see over the last 24 to 48 hours to what has been happening since the start of the war in February?
Well, look, there's certainly been thousands of missile strikes by Russia in Ukraine over the past number of months. This certainly looked like a bit of a spasm, a kind of a missile temper tantrum in retaliation for the strike on the Crimean Bridge. But I also would say it's a sign of weakness. This was a very expensive strike. If you think about the cost of the reported cost of the missiles that were involved here, these were apparently some higher-end things. Kind of some debates about the effects. Perhaps other folks can speak to that in just a moment here in terms of the actual effect on the ground. But it was an expensive attack. It was a ruthless and indiscriminate attack. But you know, it really, I think, again, speaks to Russian relative weakness at this point.
All right, Bohdan, to get you in, as Tom was speaking about, that there is a debate about the actual damage caused by the recent missile strikes, 85 in number. What has been the damage on the ground? We are reading reports about power cuts across several cities because of the airstrikes.
Yes, you're quite right. They seem to be targeting this time infrastructure. We expected this in the first days of the war. They didn't go for the electricity providers, the internet centers and whatnot. But this is what they are apparently doing. I think this is partly logistical in the sense of trying to weaken Ukraine's war effort before the onset of the cold weather and energy shortages generally. And secondly, to try and demoralize the population. You said this was an offensive. It's not an offensive. This is a cowardly retaliation, as my predecessor has just said, to the strike on the Kerch Bridge linking Russia to Russian-occupied Crimea. The Russians are fighting a very cowardly war. They are losing on the battlefield. They are retreating in the south and in the north, in the Kharkiv region. And what's left for them is to hurl missiles from the Caspian Sea, airplanes there, or send kamikaze drones, Iranian drones from Belarus. So the damage in Kyiv, I'm based in Kyiv at the moment, look, it was horrific to see several rockets land in the center of Kyiv and to see the bodies and the smashed cars, right? But we've been used to that now. This particular phase of the intensified war has been continuing since February, but we've been at war with Russia effectively since 2014 when they seized Crimea and the Donbass. That war in the Donbass never stopped. So right now, the Ukrainians are making gain. Morale is high, and there is a sense of outrage, you know, throughout the country. Let me just, one last note. They are not just targeting Kyiv and the east of Ukraine. They are hitting areas in the west of Ukraine, Lviv, for example, the western city, in Transcarpathia, in the Odessa region. The attacks are spread throughout the country, and it's a large country.
Right. The attacks are spread across the country that you are seeing, Bohdan. But coming back to Tom, we're also getting reports and we're reading how the British intelligence is saying that Russia is falling short of weapons. Their forces are exhausted. The fact that they are now fielding released prisoners shows how desperate they are. How seriously would you take this reportage and Russia's capacity to continue this war?
You know, I did see that report. I hope that's true. I'm a little bit cautious about being too premature in terms of the number of missiles that Russia has. They do have quite a few. Again, I think it's a sign of weakness that they're expending them at the rate that they are, at the costs that they are. Yes, they've been hitting infrastructure, but these are really expensive long-range missiles to be doing that. So we'll see how many more they have. The question is kind of what do we do in reaction to that, I think. And I think the provision of increased fires of missiles of offensive forces on the part of the United States and the part of others, I think is a very good way to get after that, to continue to hold at risk, whether it be their air bases or what have you, into Russia, to give them back a little bit of the taste of their own medicine here. And so I think you're going to continue to see that. You're also seeing quite a bit of attention, and President Zelensky is talking about this himself, quite a bit of attention to the question of air defense and active air defense. In the past 10 years or so, we've really taken air superiority for granted in the West. That is something we can't do anymore. And just look at the extraordinary demand signal for any kind of air defense, be it old S-300s, be it NASAMS and these kind of things that are apparently en route to Ukraine right now. The Ukrainians claim to have shot down a number of these cruise missiles over the past a couple days that they came in. Perhaps some of them failed. A number of them seem to have been taken out in one way or another. So I think you're going to continue to see increased demand for that. The other thing is, if the British report that you referenced is true, right, if they are running out, the question is what's going to happen to the Russian defense industry if they continue to remain under sanctions and aren't able to reproduce.
Right. Those are important questions there. Bohdan, coming to you, the Ukrainian president has once again opened dialogue with the G7. What does Ukraine need at this juncture? What are they asking for from the US, the UK, the European Union?
Well, he's not opened. He's continuing the dialogue. Obviously, the G7 are strongly behind, like the EU, the States, and the North Atlantic Alliance. All the democratic states are behind Ukraine. They're asking for sustained support, no fatigue, in no let-up in the support that's given, moral, financial, and with arms in particular. Look, we've got two other factors here that need to be taken into account. We have the General Assembly at this moment, yesterday and until tomorrow, discussing the annexation by Russia of 4 regions of Ukraine. We hope that India will also not be neutral and will condemn this action. It's important for Ukraine to have the support of countries like India, China, Brazil, for instance, those that, let's put it diplomatically, have sat on the fence up till now. It's very important to resist this temptation to fall into the blackmail from the Kremlin about nuclear war. What is left for Putin, who is in a very weakened position at home domestically, is waving his nuclear missiles. Remember, it's not just nuclear missiles. There are nuclear power stations, one of which, the largest in Europe, is in the hands of the Russians right now. The blackmail is very tough. The other thing I would say is that, you know, they threatened the world with starvation. They were saying, well, you know, unless Ukraine stops the war, although they were occupying the very important agricultural areas of Ukraine and blocking the ports, there will be famine. You know, everybody from India to Africa will suffer. It's very important not to fall into this kind of blackmail and to hold a united stance at a time when we have a guy in the Kremlin who is feared by his own people. Look, more Russians have left to avoid mobilization men than have actually been conscripted. That tells you something, you know.
Right. That's an important point, Bohdan, but let me now go back to Tom. Tom, how is the United States now going to step up support for Ukraine? And a connected question, to what extent can the United States get further involved in this conflict? They are not directly involved. They're supporting Ukraine with intelligence and weapons. But if this conflict escalates further, and there are strong signs that it may happen, to what extent can U.S. involvement increase?
Well, first of all, I just want to agree with what Bohdan said there about complimenting India and other folks for weighing in diplomatically. That's a very welcome sign. But I would say for the part of the United States, I would say that we're pretty deeply involved here in terms of the provision of arms, and I think that's, but also intelligence and perhaps assistance on the non-kinetic or cyber side of things. There's probably a lot of that going on that we don't see. So, frankly, I think there's a lot there. There are further steps that could be taken. For instance, the provision of longer-range missiles to the Ukrainians. There's kind of a cessation of the Ukrainians' ask for the ATACMS, which is the longer-range missile that goes into the HIMARS launcher. There are certainly those things. There is questions about the kind of where this goes in terms of the handing off of various munitions. But there are further steps that could be taken. I would also, again, agree with my colleague here, Bohdan, in terms of the fact that this is these nuclear threats and these threats of escalation. I mean, come on, they've already escalated at this point, trying to go after Ukraine existentially. That is pretty escalatory so far. But those nuclear threats, that is a sign of weakness, and so I think we just have to wear them down slowly, gradually, without giving them further excuses, but slowly, quietly. And lethally wear them down.
Right. Bohdan, when we speak about Belarus President Lukashenko has deployed his own troops alongside the Russian troops along the Ukraine border, along some parts of it. What could be the possible impact and dangers of this now?
Well, Belarus is obviously a captive nation, and it's under a cruel dictator who imposed himself, having cheated in the elections. The population is not supporting him, and it's not supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So he has a tough uphill battle because he's resisted so far from doing what the Russians want, falling squarely behind the Russians, and he's tried to say that Belarus is not really involved. Yesterday, he obviously was pushed by Putin into agreeing to the establishment of a regional force. Euphemistically, what does that mean? We know from even the Belarusian side, the official Belarusian side, that the Ukrainians are well prepared on their side of the border. They've blown up bridges. They are waiting for the Belarusians to come, if they come. And they won't be Belarusians, they'll be Russians, essentially. Now, I think that the main tactic here is to deter Ukrainians, or rather to distract Ukraine and to take away forces that by defending Kyiv that would normally be utilized in the south and in the ongoing offensive in the northeast. So I think it's more of a distraction and not really something we can expect. On the other hand, it is quite clear that the Russians are using Belarus as a staging area for air attacks, and increasingly they're using Iranian drones, not just missiles, kamikaze drones, as we call them, to attack targets in Ukraine. What will happen? I don't know, but I would guess that within Belarus itself there will be a resistance movement, and there will be continuing sabotage of railway lines, attacks on supply depots and whatnot, because the Belarusians also want to be part of Europe. They don't want to be part of a dictatorial Eurasia imposed by Russia.
All right, we've run out of time, but very quickly, Tom, in just about 10, 15 seconds, do you feel that US, as this war now takes a new turn, will US now put more pressure on countries like India to come out, take a stand, and try and push Russia to come to the negotiating table in a sincere manner?
Well, we'll see whether Russia's willing to do that. But I think that our friends in India, I think we're coming to recognize really the Russians for their true colors. And I think this is an opportunity to recognize that we have threats in common. We have China as a geopolitical rival to us both. And I think we should use this as an opportunity to recognize and look forward to the future about that which we have in common and push back on the likes of Russia and China together.
Right. Tom Karako Bohdan Nahaylo, thank you so much for joining us here on Newscentre on the current developments in the Ukraine-Russia war. We're heading into a short break, but don't go anywhere. We've got an exclusive interview with Cisco's Dave West, who says 5G implementation is integral to its India plan and how a pan-India telecom license will help the company. Don't go anywhere. That interview is coming up.